Welcome, folks, to Altis and our webinar series. Today's topic is what's referred to in the literature and a lot of coaching circles as general preparation phases. And I work primarily in power speed events. I work in a lot of diverse sport, from field sport to court sport to track and field with jumpers and combined events, sprinters and short hurdlers. So today we're going to talk about an alternative viewpoint on how to utilize and what the purpose is of what is coined in the literature general preparation phase. So an overview, I think some questions we ought to put out there right from the beginning is that general preparation phases are often generalized to endorse concepts like building a base or a foundation for the athlete to train, or preparing an athlete to train. So the key question for me today is a base of what, or a foundation for what specific qualities? And a follow-up question would be, is there evidence that general contextual work during these periods and general workloads, do they actually promote or evolve specific work capacities in KPI areas? KPI is a term we use for key performance indicators, things that are critical for performances to move forward for that given athlete. So I think the question is really about how to develop specific work capacities for specific sporting events. I think there's a tendency to think that if we do a lot or do more of general menu items or activities, that these enhance or further support specific capacities and work. So I think we have to go back a little bit into the history of periodization, and I'm sure most of our audience are familiar with works like Dietrich Hari in East Germany, and Bumpa and Matveev in the Russian circles, and contemporary guys like Anatoly Bondarchuk. So periodization's been a hot ticket topic for probably 40, 50 years now. But the origins of most of the scientific work and the academic work in periodization is found in the old Eastern Bloc sport cultures. And I think we have to understand that ergonomic assistance was a huge component of periodizational models in these Eastern Bloc sport cultures. I don't think we can get away from that elephant in the room. So I think we have to understand that a lot of the classic periodizational modeling was influenced by a culture and a science and a system and a pedagogy that was sourced strongly in biochemical studies and biochemical interface. As time went on, a lot of these periodizational constructs or attempts at organizing training was reinforced by endurance coaches in European and North American circles of influence. So some of these ideas of building a base or doing certain types of work before other types of work was hugely influenced by the endurance community, the coaches that were systematic and that had the lecture rostrum influenced programming from that standpoint. And then this was further spurned by research of physiologists, and a lot of physiologists in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s had endurance bias and interest. So some of these ideas of general preparation may have sound foundational premises or constructs in endurance events, but they may come up short, in my opinion, my experience, in power speed events. Another thing to consider is the competition calendars in early periodizational modeling was built for one or two major test meets that season. In the current climate, like in track and field, where athletes have to qualify for national teams months before the Olympics or World Championships, and they have to do fundamental meets to develop meet readiness, the ability to peak for a couple weeks of the year once or twice a year is no longer a practical objective. We have athletes that are competing at world-class levels from the beginning of indoor season in track and field, which is late January, all the way through the end of August or early September. So the puzzle has really shifted competitively, and I think that has to be taken into consideration in programming. So let's switch to some commonly asked questions on how we here at Altis in the power speed areas deal with annual planning schemes and the lack of a GPP format. I think one of the most common comments or lines of questioning we get with visiting coaches or coaches in our apprentice coaching course is, where is the general prep work or format? We're not seeing it. So hopefully we can answer some of those questions as we move through the webinar today. So these questions are kind of culled from a lot of data and trend seeking that we've had at these coaches courses, or from emails. I do a lot of emailing with coaches all over the world. And so they kind of go in a hierarchy and a frequency of being asked. So the number one, probably most common question that we get is, what is the purpose of general prep as we see it, since it means something different to every coach? For us, people that do general prep or put emphasis on general prep, the first and foremost thing that they're trying to do is teach menu items on the planning schedule. So they're trying to familiarize athletes with jargon and systems and terms and ideas and concepts and various physical training entities. So a lot of attempts at general prep, I think, address this and address it fairly well. For us, it's to develop a context for future teaching progressions and mastery of those progressions of skills and movement schemes. I think a lot of people use general prep type work or design to ascertain general and specific fitness levels and readiness levels. We try to do that in a more specific, less general way, but that entity of where are we at, how are we doing, are we ready for future training or more difficult training, is addressed in that time of year or that phase. I think during this period, really good power speed and technical coaches monitor movement kinetics and kinematics of the tasks that they have listed on the menu. So looking at various biomechanical entities kinetically and kinematically to see where we're at, what's our state of readiness, are there gaps, are there needs, are there strengths. I think the general prep format is a good attempt to establish communication and reporting skill sets. I guess my question is, if you're reporting on general entities versus more specific entities, what is the gap in terminology development if you spend a huge amount of time or excessive amount of time on general qualities? And then lastly, to improve biological and biomotor abilities that support sport-specific stressors. So I think there's some conflict, and I think the literature is a little bit all over the shop when looking at, does general type of work and general type of work capacities improve specific or more precise biological pathways and routings, and definitely what is going on to the various spectrums of biomotor abilities that support that sport. Second most common question we get is, how does GPP change based on different athletes in the same event group or based on athlete training age? I think younger, less developed athletes may benefit greatly from a well-designed general prep phase. But the question is as you age and mature and you acquire skill and abilities and background, how cost-effective is spending a great deal of time or energy, either from a programming standpoint or the actual athlete actually going through it, and an advanced athlete. So if there's sport-specific gaps or ability level differences or lacking in general athletic knowledge, these can be easily monitored and addressed in young athletes with general preparation phases. So then they say, well, if you don't do general work, which is so common in most training systems around the world, where do you place your value for the GPP? So how we start the training year is with thorough debriefs and analysis of the athlete we have before us. And we determine what are the key performance indicator factors that will dictate the construction of the annual plan and the length that we spend in various phases and mesocycles and microcycles. And this analysis and this KPI evolution and ranking system will then dictate menu-specific items, which in turn dictates length of phase of microcycles and mesocycles. So some of the key ticket items that we look at from athlete analysis and KPI factors involve technical, not only in the event specificity, but the technical abilities in the training menu items that support the event specifics. We look at physiological and genetical factors. We look at wellness, what is the state of the athlete, chronic injuries, acute injuries, illnesses. We explore lifestyle factors like sleep hygiene, diet, nutrition, coping strategies, mental resilience skills, which leads us into the mental KPI factors. And then closely tied to that are the emotional control and coping strategies. And then lastly, we look at environmental and sport knowledge. So from this list, we develop an analysis and a KPI listing of factors that we need to address for this specific athlete. And that more or less forms what we're doing in those first few cycles of the training year. I think with a younger athlete that's less developed, if they're in our group, they may have a hybrid between a classical GPP and what people would call a special prep mesocycle design. So in question 3, if you don't do general work, where do you place your value? This is an expansion of that. This is part 2. With more mature and advanced athletes, we do a deep analysis of these KPI factors, gaps they have in all these KPI factors, the health variables that they are currently dealing with or have dealt with the previous training year and competition year. And above all, we have to look at the competition calendar, which is coming up and before us. So that will result in us starting the year with more of a special prep phase design rather than a general prep phase design. So how do we get started on that, or how do we look at that, or what are the foundation for our thought process? Well, we do an ergonomic, a term for the study of work, the types and amounts of work that an individual is going through in their task. And we do an environmental sweep of the sport and the athlete before us. So this leads to what we call a KPI listing. The use of KPI analysis aids us in the structure and ordering of the planning, both for the annual plan and for the various phases and the various microcycles. So we roll from this into identifying a hierarchy in these performance development KPI factors. So once we have a list of, say, 20 or 30 things that we think are really important for this coming year, then we rank them. We develop a ranking system. What's first and foremost that we have to safeguard, that we have to emphasize, and from there we build a pyramid out. So while on KPIs, I think we have to realize it's a double-edged sword. So there's key performance indicators, things that we've identified that are critical for improvement or athlete health and wellness and for mastery, but there's also key performance inhibitors, things that get in the way, that interfere, or that are causing injury or chronicity of injury. And so our KPI listing is not only indicators for performance, but inhibitors for performance. So my first litmus test on KPIs is this entity or our plan, our strategy, is it logical and is it founded on common sense? I think there's a little bit short supply in some circles. People have gotten so academic and so theoretical and idealistic that some of these ideas just fail these two tests. So as we said earlier, the classification of KPI is technical. This can be technique that's event specific. It can be technique in the weight room. It could be technique during plyometric activities. It could be breaking the event down into subsections and looking at the various technical components there. from a kinetic and kinematic standpoint. Technical strategies, anything that falls under the header of technique, we'll list strengths, weaknesses, gaps, and that will formulate a KPI system for us for designing the annual plan in those first few cycles. We look at the physiology of the athlete. For example, with a jumper, genetically linked and physiologically enhanced, do they convert quickly, or are they a moderate converter, or are they a slow converter? So that will have influence on the technical model, that will have influence on menu items that we develop to maybe shift that a little bit or enhance the athlete's health with their classification. Wellness is always a huge KPI for us. Athletes get injured, and in a perfect world they never would, but we inherit athletes here at Altis. So we have athletes that have had 2 or 3 high school coaches, maybe a couple club coaches, 1 or 2 university coaches, maybe a post-university coach. So by the time they've come to us, they may have made some mistakes. They may have accumulated and developed chronic injury patterns and compensation patterns. So we have to do a thorough screening of looking at competition tapes, practice tapes, and putting them through our various movement screens and analyses and injury records and histories, where we look at the indice of their wellness, and that wellness will have a huge foundation on volumes and intensities and rate of shift from menu item to menu item. Lifestyle is another huge KPI entity, so the quality of sleep, the amount of sleep, what's going on with diet nutritional schemes. Do these need to be modulated throughout the training year or during difficult cycles or high work cycles, or how does this shift when they're in a high intensity, low volume cycle? So there's a lot of factors that go into the KPI classification of various lifestyle systems. The mental, emotional are tightly linked, so we spend a great deal of time on building mental resiliency, and I think this is where there's a disconnect. I think that there's a trend out there, if people do long and grinding general prep cycles, that somehow mentally they're going to become tougher, they're going to become more resilient, and they'll have better emotional control. In my experience, that doesn't happen. It's not true. I've seen a lot of athletes that can endure some insane general prep, general quality type training. They can vomit numerous times. They can get cramps. They can crawl off the track. But in the arena, in the Olympics, they fold badly, mentally and emotionally. It doesn't hold up. We think mental skill sets and emotional control and coping skill sets are very layered. They have broad scope, deep scope on causality, systems, strategies, and implementation. So we spend a great deal of time developing programs to enhance that, and it's not done with physical preparation. And then lastly, environmental and sport knowledge. Improving the athlete's capacity to deal with environmental factors and improve their knowledge base is critical. And a mature athlete that's been at the world-class level 10 years may have certain weaknesses and gaps in both of these realms. And you're not going to address those gaps by doing general work that's not related to their sport. So we use a general classification scheme. Here's a tree where there's 5 or 6 different species. It's a hybrid tree, and that's kind of how we look at training. So let's look at a pole vaulter for an example. How do we classify activities from a generational standpoint? So if we want to call something first generation for this pole vaulter, that would be competition length approach jumps on competition length poles, in competition type situations and stressors. So that would be first generation. Second generational work would be doing shorter run jumps, reduced approach, event specific, so various pole vaulting drills into the pit that might not mimic the actual jump, but they're teaching progressions or subsets of the jump. Third generational activities would be things that support pole vaulting, so acceleration workouts, speed workouts, various jump exercises. Fourth generation would be different schemes in the weight room, plyometric schemes, throwing schemes for power development, perhaps applied gymnastics. We do some alactic running with our pole vaulters to support the ability to do more speed runs and acceleration runs. And then we have wellness exercises, but those are fourth generation. So you note here, there's very little general or fifth generational work for our pole vaulters at any time of the year. We're somewhere in second and third generation early in the training year, and as those qualities come around, then we shift more into the first generational work. So what do we typically do in that time period for various power speed events? Well, we train these KPI factors with systematic progression of loads. Through experience and trend analysis and data analysis, we kind of know where the ceiling is. How many acceleration runs can an athlete do, and how many do we need to enhance skill? And so we have a ceiling and we have a basement on every menu item that we have, and we start out the training year at basement level work, unless we know the athlete really well, and they may start with a little bit mid-level type work, and we progress from there in a very systematic fashion. And we also address injury factors from the previous season during this period. So there may be a bit more second or third generational work trying to enhance and improve the injury conditions that they had from the previous season. So what are some of my thoughts on the need to develop a attritional base? Well, my first question is a base level, what components? What are you training? What are you trying to build a base for? The second question I ask young coaches is, do isolatory program schemes work long-term with advanced or aging athletes? Meaning, if I focus on building special endurance, does that lead into faster speed runs and more effective acceleration runs later in the training year? In my experience, it does not. So my question, therefore, is where is the evidence that general base menu items, developing those things, actually support enhanced event-specific demands? So there are a lot of people in general prep running long distances or doing lactate workouts. So I'll use the example of a high jumper. A high jumper needs to be able to run 10 or 12 steps really fast rhythmically and then convert that speed vertically. And in a competition, they'll take maybe 12 jumps. I don't see how running 300 meters and 1,000 meters and lactate breakdown runs is enhancing an advanced athlete to improve those qualities. So segues into question 6. So how does prep differ for an athlete that has been exposed to a program that has not had a lot of variety? Well, as I said, we do a thorough and a layered analysis of the KPI factors of the athlete, their histories, their strengths, their weaknesses, and these needs drive the process. If there's a gap, if there's a weakness in contextual or foundational work items, then our first instinct is not let's do a lot of general stuff filling in this gap or spending a great deal of time doing fourth or fifth generational work. Our first instinct is how can we advance these issues with early generational schemes that segue into specific work rather quickly. So what are the risks for me with traditional GPP methodology? I see a lot of overwork leading to fatigue-driven issues. I see people that shift biochemistry and biological pathways that take months to recover from and to realign into more specific work. I see a lot of detraining of the KPI factors they've identified. So, for example, several of our pole vault gals this year have identified mental resilience skill sets as their number one KPI. They're relatively healthy, they're good shape, they're fast, they're powerful, they're competing at a fairly high level, but in key competitions, things fall apart. Well, that's a mental resiliency factor. So they're only going to fall apart in a competitive setting. So we have to get more elite competitive settings for these athletes. And to do that, we have to build a bigger, quote, base of meet approach jumping so that they can support a longer, more detailed, more pressurized calendar. It's not going to be done by doing anaerobic running workouts on the track. And lastly, I see a lot of mechanical degradation. When people do a lot of general work, the mechanics, the rhythm, the postures have a tendency to get very sloppy. And a lot of times those stereotypes, those dynamic stereotypes become habitual, and then when they try to do things at higher intensity with higher mastery, there's confusion in the brain maps and there's confusion in the biological systems. So we safeguard biomechanics and mechanical efficiency here, and to do that, we're not able to have too many menu items that are 5th and 6th generational in our hierarchy of training order. I see a lot of inefficient use of mental, physical, and emotional resources in general prep. So people doing grinding workouts or grinding menu items thinking that they're going to enhance mental and physical and emotional resources. My experience in measurement, and monitoring programs, and mentoring a lot of coaches, I don't see that happening. I actually see a lot of inefficiency. And I think lastly, if you spend too much time or have too many menu items that are general, you delay, and there's an inappropriate evolution of structures, biochemistry, and event techniques. This to me is probably the most worrisome thing that I express and question young coaches with is all this general work or 4th or 5th generational type work delaying and interfering with the appropriate evolution of the various structures that the athletes have to have in place for event-specific training? How is it altering and affecting biochemistry? And what is it doing to the timeline of technique evolution? So what is the difference between traditional schemes and the skill development that you believe in? Well, we think skill development must occur regularly and constantly in elite sport. PGA golfers and world-class basketball players wouldn't go months on end without doing their sport. So we are doing 1st and 2nd generational activities with our athletes at the beginning of the training year because it's skill and it's very specific skills. And I think skill levels have a shelf life, and if they're ignored or they're not enhanced or they're not challenged, the skill levels have a tendency to degrade. I think skill is very dependent on the ability to focus, and it's very, very unique to the intensity at which you're doing the activity, and it's also very sensitive to the variance that's occurring around the athlete while they're doing it. So with this in mind, if you're doing a lot of general prep, tiring work, or work that's unrelated to the skill, I find the athlete's ability to focus or to deliver the necessary intensity is diminished. And I also see a huge reduction in variance factors when athletes are in chronically fatigued states. I think also that skill relearning or task elimination demands a physiological readiness for task. So when an athlete comes to you and they have errors and you want to eliminate those errors, the athlete has to have a certain physiological readiness to undertake this. If they have been away through injury or a planned break or whatever, and there's some relearning involved, again, the physiological readiness is key. It's hard to relearn or to break habits if you're in a chronic fatigue state or you're in a conditioned state where you're doing general global activities and all of a sudden you're asked to do very specific timed coordinated activities. So what intensity do we start at? What volumes do you use, and what rest periods do you use at the beginning of the training year? Well, we use intensities that are appropriate for the task or the learning and evolution of that task and the event demands and the athlete's health status. So when that athlete starts the training, the first couple of weeks of the training year, like where are they at health-wise, emotionally, mentally, skill sets? What are the gaps we've identified? What are the KPIs we're working on? What are the ceilings and basements for each menu item in terms of volume and intensities? And then we start there. The volume's probably not as high as they could be. The intensity may not be as high as it could be. We're a little bit short the first few cycles till we get to know where the athlete's state of readiness really is. But we're rolling at pretty high intensities at very, very commensurate volumes very early in the process. So the things you do that you consider to be general, of course, there are qualities and behaviors and concepts that support more refined execution. So some of our strength circuits and med ball circuits and hurdle mobility activities, they're obviously fourth generational, but they give us a chance to teach and develop jargon and feedback. They serve as movement screens. They give us teaching moments. So there is general type of activity, even though we don't start in a classic general preparation phase. We have these general qualities all year long, even in the competitive phase, so that we look at them as supportive measures rather than general measures. Many folks label these activities general. We call them supportive. We train and teach many of these factors, but always with the mindset of, can we do these activities with higher generational work tasks? So rather than doing mindless men ball tosses back and forth, perhaps we're doing a unique delivery of a med ball that's accentuating a movement pattern or supporting a movement pattern in their event-specific activities. So are there anything that you do that you consider general? Part two, yeah, of course. We do the circuit training, as I mentioned, on the field and in the gym. We do medicine ball circuits. We do ancillary lifts in the gym. Those lifts are designed to support higher generational lifts. They may be dealing with injury or wellness factors. They may be dealing with brain maps to supply context for future, more sophisticated tasks. So as I said earlier, many would call this general training, but we look at it as a mode to enhance these brain maps, serve as movement screens, and in time serve as parasympathetic stimulus. A lot of these activities, once the athlete has adapted to them, actually flip into more parasympathetic response mechanisms. So what is your system for monitoring volume and intensity lines through the season? And do they cross? And if they do cross, where does that happen? I found in power speed events, the undulation of volume and intensity is not as drastic and maybe not as statistically significant as it might be in middle distance running or endurance events. I think due to the nature of these events and the menu items that we select on our KPI hierarchy rating, we have very little room to fluctuate volume and intensity with elite performers. Some of these entities, like there's a graph here looking at hippocampus activity during sprinting. As you can see, there's not a real nice curve there. There's definitely no crossing. Some of these physiological entities don't fit classical periodizational modeling and curves and graphs. So I think in some events, the crossing of volume and intensity, it might be a bigger factor to monitor, but I think it's very much less so in sprint jump programming, for example. So what are the one or two things that most programs could do to improve the quality of their first 6 to 8 weeks, which a lot of people call general preparation phase? I see a trend of non-purposeful work or potentially dangerous work being done during GPP in a lot of programs. People cannot rationalize or support why they're doing an activity, why they're doing the volume they are at the intensity they are. It's copy and paste, it's mimicking somebody else's program that they may have done 5 years ago. There's a lot of disinformation out there. My test for young coaches is Why is it in there? Why are you doing that volume? And why are you doing it at that intensity? Why are the work to rest ratios as such? If it's several generations away from the event specifics, I ask them to validate, is it a teaching progression? Is it a supportive issue for future generational activities? But you have to have a reason why they're doing what we see a lot of in technical general preparation programming. So you should be able to defend it on why it's in there. And please stop the nonsense, the gut-wrenching workouts that are general in nature, build mental resilience, and support specific training needs. The evidence is just not there. So if I were coaching youth or collegiate athletes, would I do the same thing? I do coach these type of athletes. We have age group athletes, we have masters athletes. Just this week I've worked with athletes 8 years old and 84 years old. And I've done this for 4 decades. My philosophy is the same. So programming should be based on needs, on KPI factors, and above all, sound science as we understand it. Programming spectral. And rigid parameters often lead to inferior development. So where on the spectrum is this athlete with needs and KPIs? And it's not always start over at the lowest end of the spectrum and move forward. We have world-class athletes because of surgeries or life miss entire autumns and early winter of training, yet go on to have excellent competition seasons. They don't need to start in the general prep phase. So the utilization of classic GPP and power speed sporting events has morphed over the past 2 decades. I've seen a big change in how it's used and what are the components and what are the ideas and rationalization behind program. The use, the components included, and the length of the cycle are truly dependent on training age, KPI factors, and the contextual needs. Some athletes need background or 4th or 5th generational work to support 1st and 2nd generational work because they have gaps there. So modern competition calendars, as we stated earlier in the talk, demand closer scrutiny of GPP schemes. If you have to compete 6-7 months of the year, do you really want to spend 2 or 3 months of the training year in general prep? You're going to have to rush something if you do. So I'd like to kind of close up with inviting people to Altis to see how we do things and how operations run here. We host monthly ACP programs for coaches of all sporting events and abilities. We have coaches from all over the world visit: rugby, European football, push sports and Winter Olympics, downhill skiing, golf, you name it. It's a cool way to network and to get exposed to best practice and current trends. Periodization is a common topic in these programs, both in the lectures that we supply and in the roundtable discussions that we have at the end of each day. So I would encourage professionals interested in this topic to attend future programs, and you can find that information on our website, readily available.